Very kind of you, but it is really exciting to be back with our medicine colleagues and talk a little bit about sort of where I think we're going in the future, a little bit of lessons I've learned in the last 2 years while I leave, and really the implications on how we might want to think through the way we do science a bit differently. So, as Errol said, I have conflicts of interest here. This is intended to, of course, be non-promotional, but I am a corporate officer of a company whose products I will be mentioning, and my grant support and other disclosures are shown here. So I'll start with the problem statement as I see it. There are a lot of papers on AI and digital health written. There's a lot of great work. Stanford is at ground zero for this. A couple of years ago at the Center for Digital Health, we performed a landscape report. There's a lot happening, and it's fantastic. But then there's a gap. Not as many products are made. And when they are, they suffer from meaningful evidence because to get the product to the market took all the resources, and now you have to create evidence. What then happens is if you don't have the evidence, you can't get broader adoption, and you sort of go from idea to paper to podium to grave. And often, we know this already, health tech and academia often live in separate worlds. And so how do you reconcile these two? So this is from Jeffrey Moore. This is a famous book called Crossing the Chasm. It's not a healthcare book, but it really talks about where products fail in the market very, very broadly, and the distribution of people who want them. So the early adopters are the innovators and the early adopters. They want the new shiny stuff. In cardiology, that is part of our culture, but not exclusively. Then you have a wave of adoption between the majorities and then those who trail and are late adopters. Those people want complete solutions and convenience. The chasm is going from early adoption to scale, and that's often what we see in healthcare. So if you make the same analog to health technologies, I would argue you have early product in science, paper and podium, you have the people who build, you have the pilots in the multi-center sites, but then we don't know what happens. And this bell curve actually is unproven and undefined for healthcare, but I think it's probably related to getting early adoption through reimbursement, guideline recommendations, and then quality measures. And that's when you sort of, that's the carrot or the stick where people ultimately adopt. We don't really have that precedence in digital technologies. We definitely do for medications and certain screening modalities, but I think this is the real problem we have in health technology. So if you focus on the first part, the builders want to show it's feasible. The multi-center pilots and the trials generally have soft endpoints for budget reasons or improper surrogates that don't scale. And often there's no commitment to adoption if it's successful. And so therefore you have this chasm where at Stanford, we often call it death by pilot, limited adoption, friction with integration, not having the commercial support because it's an academic program, product, and then often you have no reimbursement or misaligned incentives. And so how do you get around these? This is something we did with Connie Chen when she was a resident in 2017. So it's dated now, but the same things apply. We looked at all the digital health studies in clinicaltrials.gov. You can see the composition by patient category. They were mostly in cardiac or cardiometabolic, followed by mental health and wellness. Industry trials were more likely to be terminated, but here was the real kicker, is that almost half of these studies had less than 100 patients. And so how does that actually meaningfully generalize? How do we do things differently so things can be adopted and scale? This is something I've also noticed probably worth a good, I think, resident or fellow project. On the left is a simple search on PubMed with AI papers referencing diagnostic and cardiology. You can see the explosion. However, with 700 papers published, almost 700 in the last 2 years, the number of cleared algorithms is only 100 in total. And so what happens is most of these papers are fabulous and could be groundbreaking, but they don't get fully integrated on the front end with products as they were made often on the back end from a lot of the data aggregations. And so then if you want to implement it, it becomes an add-on layer. It's not in the product in front of you. It's another pass-through layer, and we see this in cardiology. The other issue is, can you extend some of these modalities to work? For example, a lot of the 12-lead AI, do you really need 12 leads? Are there other ways to do this? What about consumer? And so there's a lot of great work happening. But again, how can you get that directly on the device at the point of care? This is work from the AHA SFRN program led by Alex Sandhu and many others here, where they're doing really fabulous work, where they've developed an app and a patient tool to optimize rapidly guideline-directed medical therapy as an outpatient. You can see there's an analytics dashboard. There's a planned 130 patient trial for a 90-day medication optimization store. The question is, we all want this to go through. We believe in it. What happens post-trial? How do you avoid that chasm? This is a tool that leads to chart review acceleration. It's been piloted in many places, including Stanford, and this is browser-based. The chart review time went down from 18 minutes to 12 minutes. In one place, it scaled 9,000 hours saved. It led to improvements in documentation as well as charge capture. But again, how does this avoid the valley of death? Because there's no direct incentive, and there are all of the friction points shown. So again, these are great technologies. They're going to move the needle, but they don't get adopted. The other corollary is some products just stay in the consumer space forever, and we see this with many of the technologies our patients have. It's really in the wellness domain. It's not true health tech, and there's a phrase called well tech for that. Yet we as clinicians are burdened with the information, and the intended use and the liability if we don't use it is murky. We're forced to review the data without really a workload capture or reimbursement model, again, misaligning incentives. We don't know how well these do in the real world post-market. They are pre-diagnostics, but how do they actually do, and are they having unintended effects with respect to safety? So these are actually two wearables that were there before and we started talking about them. These were actually cleared by the FDA in the 1990s and had reimbursement tied to Holter monitoring. They obviously didn't scale, maybe because of technology limitations, but the world just wasn't ready for them. You can see the one on the left actually has a phone jack that you plug your landline in to transmit. So again, in the mid-1990s, this is way ahead of its time, and probably too far ahead of its time. But we do have these now, which our patients have for pre-diagnosis. And this algorithm works. It's been validated where it has generally a high specificity approach to identifying an sustained irregular pulse that is likely atrial fibrillation. And this was a study done out of Stanford, led by Dr. Marco Perez, myself, along with a very sharp team, including Manisha Desai and so many others. But what you see is that this thing does what it's supposed to. On the right, the positive predictive value of the algorithm for simultaneous AFib was 84%. On the left, you see that we identified AFib in 0.5% of the overall population, and obviously more in older people. So it does what it's supposed to, but is it having any unintended effects? And so again, we a couple of years ago had support from the FDA and from Russ Altman's center, the CIRSE, the Center for Excellence in Regulatory Science, to have a series of think tanks. And we had a graphic artist who really did this, talking about what the post-market challenges are. We have post-market mechanisms for drug safety, for regulated medical device safety, but we don't really have a huge framework for pre-diagnosis. So what actually happens to a consumer when they have a notification and they become a patient? Is the care appropriate? Is there overutilization? Is it underutilization? What is the impact on outcomes? And so as we were working through this and as I transitioned out on leave, Nigam Shah led a great effort with a then fellow Krishna Pundi to really use EMR mining and some AI tools to identify patients at Stanford and across the entire VA who had wearable notifications for atrial fibrillation. And so the number wasn't trivial, 3,400 in Stanford alone. In the VA, there were 11,000 nationwide. What you see here is that these are not just sort of the worried well. These are the people you would expect to have these notifications. At Stanford, 44% female, obviously much lower in the VA because of the case mix. But they had comorbidities, as you see here. Some were already on antiarrhythmics. They're not supposed to be using this if you have a prior diagnosis, but they were. So these patients really have this. What happened with healthcare utilization? Well, if you look here from Stanford, what you can see is patients who presented received the testing as shown here. So almost about 30 to 38% received echoes. Many received ambulatory ECG monitoring. Some went to angiograms and stress testing. And there was a little bit of a difference if it was found that you actually had a prior diagnosis of AFib. You can see the utilization at the VA is a little bit lower, but not dissimilar. Here is what really struck us, and which is the data around procedures that generally for a new diagnosis of AFib, you don't need. So, and what happened is it depended on the site of care. So if patients were inpatients, what you see is that they were at Stanford 4.6 times more likely, adjusted odds, to get an angiogram, 3.5 times more likely to get an echocardiogram. You also saw a similar gradient at the VA. And yes, these are inpatients, so there is some confounding. Maybe they're sicker, maybe they did present with true ischemia, but were these all appropriate? The next step is to see how many were negative, and then to see if this actually affected outcomes in the long term. But again, this is an opportunity to look post-market for these things, because these wellness products at the end of the day are being used in healthcare. But if you take all that, how do you really cross the chasm, meaningfully integrate the technology into health, ensure strong evidence on the life cycle, and I argue create new analogs for translation and implementation, and then can you scale globally? So for me, about 2 years ago, this was an opportunity to really hone in on those questions, learn some leadership and executive skills for myself and my own personal development, and take a product in a company that was the darling of the biodesign program at the time, led by Paul Yock, now led by Josh, and really see if we can take on some of these challenges. And so what I'm going to share are sort of some of the lessons from cardiology as it relates to monitoring AI and some other use cases which are areas that I've been really close to. So this is a great cartoon that I dug up and I found on the website of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. There is actually an original Holter in the museum, but this is sort of the needs statement that was characterized in the 1950s or 1960s. You can't take this machine and walk around with any sort of monitoring, ECG or otherwise. And so how do you do this? And so here's a history from the initial galvanometer by Einthoven. You see in 1947, Professor Holter, who was an engineer, is wearing a jetpack on a bike. That is actually the first Holter product. It was designed primarily for avionics and aviation. And then you see progressive miniaturization. In 1965, it was marketed as being as small as a box of cigarettes, ironically. But you can see how the technology in a few decades evolved very, very quickly. Where we are now is we have lots of different monitoring options, and the problem is the technology is outpacing the categories of reimbursement. The tried and true Holter is shown here in the top left. This is from a review article we published earlier this year. It's really there because those pictures I just showed you were using audio cassettes or analog recording and didn't have the capacity to go more than a couple hours, and then it became a couple days on an audio cassette. You then progress to a variety of modalities that were patch-based with extended monitoring, and then with progressive uptake of both longer monitoring and the ability for onboard algorithms to transmit cellularly what if an arrhythmia was happening, so that you don't have to wait until the end of wear. You can have 24/7 attendant coverage and get that. And that evolved into mobile cardiac telemetry. We also have consumer devices and smartphone devices. These are very real. These are part of our sort of clinical environment that we use in cardiology and actually increasingly in primary care across the country. So again, there's a lot here, but these technologies are moving very, very rapidly. And actually, the first consumer watch to have FDA clearance for blood pressure came out by Casio in 1991. You can still find these on eBay. There was a recent IEEE paper that shows that they don't work very well, but apparently it's not new. And so now we've progressed through a series of devices, and this continues to evolve. And I'll talk about multimodal sensing. So again, as the technology evolves from a couple hours to 2 days to a patch to longer monitoring, it doesn't take rocket science to really show that this works better. More monitoring does mean better diagnostic yield and capture. And this was some early work we did a very, very long time ago looking at this product. It just makes sense. And the standards have been changed. really change to have 14 or 30 days of monitoring. And we also have insertable cardiac monitors when longer monitoring is needed in certain rare event situations. Does it really make a difference? Does it really help? And so again, this becomes an outcomes research opportunity in the absence of randomized trial data to really show that actually more monitoring that's continuous is better, not just because you find things, but because it may have clinical outcomes. In this case, diagnostic yield, odds of retesting, and what's not shown here is healthcare utilization is also decreased, both ER, hospital, and cost with 14 days. So again, I think that's where we are with digital technologies is more direct comparisons and starting to do the observational research that has long been done with drugs and with procedures extending back to diagnostics. This is a wide open area, whether it's in cardiology or other areas, and we're seeing much more health services and outcomes research going upstream to diagnostics. Where are we going kind of in the future of monitoring? It's really no longer just about cardiology, and we'll talk about that. But where the acceleration comes is AI. And so again, moving beyond ECG, probably moving beyond cardiology, both with AI and multi-sensor capabilities. We've seen in our own patients a lot of uptake of wrist-worn devices. Some of these may get medicalized, and some expanded use cases in new care settings where we're seeing traction in a lot of other healthcare systems. And so I'll talk a little bit about AI, and this is the sort of framework that I use for AI. Everyone has their own, but this is a simple 2x2 of what's easy and hard for humans and what's easy and hard for AI. And this sort of really helps me think about where we've gone in cardiology, where we continue in EP, ECG, and electrophysiology. Easy for humans and hard for AI is an interesting one, and the only one that I can really think of is folding laundry. We don't have robots that do it. It's pretty easy for humans. This will be an interesting area where can we overcome the easy efforts for humans with really, really hard AI? We're starting to see that with large language models, but really I'm going to focus on the other three boxes here. And if you really look here, again, this is not new for this audience, but where we have moved from the easy is simple rhythm classification. AI does this well to really complex rhythm classification, disease classification, and prediction. The hard part of AI is multimodal data, getting it to be safe enough such that it, if and when, can be fully autonomous, and knowing what to do with false positives. So there is data, for example, with AI for low ejection fraction. If someone has a normal ejection fraction today, but the AI says it's low, the AI in whom it said it's low versus the AI, those patients did worse and had higher risk of declines in EF than if you had a normal EF today and your AI says it's normal. So when is it a false positive, and when is that, and it's just wrong, versus when is it truly informative? That's another hard problem to solve. We've done a lot in the arrhythmia field in cardiology with automated diagnostics for a long time. This is the first expert system that's at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary in 1971. You can see it's huge. It required 2 technicians. One controlled the tape recorder and listened to the details. Second technician monitored just the 3-lead ECG. At this time, it was on an oscilloscope. And this was stored. And again, there were automated rules to do this. This is the kind of compute back then that's obviously been miniaturized and improved with AI. This is from Andrew Ng's lab here and showed that you actually can take deep learning and actually outperform, based on F1 and even other parameters, the sort of median cardiologist or median electrophysiologist. And so, again, this really changes things because it was no longer to approximate a clinician. You got to the point where you could actually exceed performance. And that, again, is quite interesting and has parallels everywhere else. So again, ECG has been very good to identify arrhythmias. It's probably in that easy box. What's harder is looking at heart failure, LVH, potassium abnormalities, prediabetes, and other things. And this is where I think monitor, whatever modality is used, can become really interesting in how we think through where we go. So can you predict AFib from a sinus rhythm ECG? The answer is yes. There's been work done here by Dr. Perez and Dr. Ashley. There's also been collaborative work done by David Oyang with that group, using some Stanford data as well as some VA and CEDARS data, which I'm showing. The first paper came out now 5 years ago in the Lancet from the Mayo group. What it shows is that the discrimination is good, and it sort of doesn't really matter what site you get the data from. The data calibrates quite well. So you can see the calibration plot on the right. So again, this is really encouraging. ECG becomes a really easy use case. What about the ability to predict ECG, AFib in the near term? If you don't have it in the first 2 weeks, can you have it in the next 2 weeks? If you don't have it in the first 2 weeks, can you have it in the next year? And so this, again, has been done. It's been done by Steve Steinhobel and the Scripps group, again, showing pretty good discrimination, not as good as the 12 lead, but again, the ability with clinical features to get to 0.8 for an ROC, as well as a reasonable positive predictor value. The problem with most diagnostics, including AI, is as the prevalence of the outcome is low, the positive predictive value is going to be low, and therefore the number needed to test or apply this to starts to go up considerably, even if the ROC curves are quite high. That becomes a implementation and public health issue rather than anything regarding the precision of the model. Can we get to heart failure and stroke? And so this was done by the Duke group. This was simple regression, taking raw ECG signal, featurizing, adding it to clinical risk factors. And what's very interesting is that it did not do so well as predicting stroke. That shouldn't be surprising from the way we know about the AF stroke relationship, but it did quite well for heart failure hospitalization when you take these. And so the next step will be to apply deep learning to this, which is ongoing, to see if we can do this. If you actually break the features down in terms of what's important, it turns out that AF burden for heart failure hospitalization in this Medicare nationwide sample didn't matter. AF, yes, no did, but burden did not. It was the PVC counts, couplets and triplets, that were more predictive when looking only at ECG signal. With deep learning, there will be much more that can't be featurized, and there's other ways to create these models. You can work through creating sort of your own unsupervised labels and make auto transformer models. But the things that we sort of assume didn't really bear out. It would make sense that bradycardia may be somewhat protective, but the sort of heart rates during a monitor period didn't matter. So it was really ventricular arrhythmias or a signal in the ventricle at this point that was most predictive. And I guess that wouldn't be surprising. So ejection fraction can be done in a 12 lead. Some, like Pierre Elias at Columbia, have broadened this to ask a bigger question of well, forget about EF or any one thing on any one structural finding. Can you just get to, does the patient need an echo? Can you generalize it to that? And the rationale for that is the combined prevalence to have any one abnormality would be higher than any one alone. And so in this case, what he did is he didn't include EF, he just included valve disease, as you see here, to see if you can get there. And again, the ROC curves are okay. The problem is when you have rare events, as you see on the right, the positive predictive values start to be low. And so are you really going to do, at a PPV, at a sensitivity threshold of PPV, when you're looking just at one finding and a disease prevalence at 2%, are you going to really do 15 echoes to find one? This is where the limitations are thus far. We don't have the precision that we would hope for. On the technology side, it doesn't matter what patch company modality is looked at. There's a lot of progress being made in form factor. There's some work here in flexible electronics with Zen and Bao and the EWAR group and others, the adhesive, connectivity, power management, and like consumer watches, there's sort of an arms race to pack as many sensors as you can for outpatient monitoring. Now, you don't need these things if you only care about an ECG, but what this opens up are sort of new opportunities in other care settings. And then when you can get indirect measurements, so you can get pulse contour velocity with other things, you may be able to get close to blood pressure. Pulse transit time doesn't work so well. You might get other things as well. Perfusion may be helpful. Congestion has been shown in some devices. And so again, the technology is outpacing the clinical use cases for it. But it is an arms race to sort of throw these on and then see what we do with them for now. Here are the things that could, however, become possible if they do bear out. So you can take some wellness features simply with an accelerometer, and this is happening now, where you can characterize sleep and activity. and this may provide useful context even outside of arrhythmia management. It may tell you if the heart block that happened at 5 a.m. occurred during sleep or not. It may clue you into sleep disordered breathing, and then get into sort of prediction, where you can actually predict sleep apnea without anything other than an ECG, but this can get more refined. We struggle with diagnosing chronotropic incompetence. That can improve. You can see a whole laundry list of things on the structural heart disease side that are emerging as viable targets for AI with good sensitivity, and again, needing to overcome the low positive predictive values that you find because the overall disease frequency is low. But again, the interesting thing here is if someone created ECG AI for amyloid or sarcoid, you can now retrospectively run that on an entire population if you have the raw signal, and this is what some health systems and companies are doing now. Motion dependence is important for a rare subset of diseases, and that's being worked on. And then again, hemodynamic and vascular areas are another exciting area. Where is the future? It's no longer going to be just monitoring for arrhythmias. What's happening with these sensors is that they're going into other disease areas, use cases, and verticals into sleep and home sleep testing for an integrated device. Heart failure and hypertension have long been talked about. They haven't borne out yet, but they're being applied. Remote patient monitoring is another area that has some challenges around reimbursement in the way it's currently done, but in value-based systems, it's being done to prevent rehospitalization, really to drive value and minimize cost in those systems. We're starting to see this being used in inpatient monitoring, where you don't have to wire somebody to leads, but they'll have a single thing on their chest or in other areas that goes to the hospital Wi-Fi or to a hub in the room that's Bluetooth that then goes onto the network. Transitioning people to hospital at home, nursing home, extended care, getting a full set of diagnostics in an easy way with EMS, and again, wellness products, and then thinking of actionable insights. So there is a lot happening here. It's going fast. We don't know where it's going to go. But this is going to go well outside of the confines of arrhythmia management into primary care, into other areas, if the use cases are correctly defined, and that's the big if. AF burden we see on the wellness side. We're also starting to see products that go in medical grade monitoring that's reimbursable. This one is not on the market yet, but the ability to get chunks of AF burden in 15 minutes at high sensitivity and specificity that is reimbursable in some health systems is an attractive alternative to managing patients' sort of wearable wellness data in the absence of EHR integration or a reimbursement model. So now I want to shift a little bit and talk about accelerating evidence generation and how can we think of implementation and pragmatic study designs in product use as well as product launches. This is the area that I've been focusing on. And so if you are going to put something out in the market or you plan to, how do you get the evidence quickly that you need? And sometimes it's not even a full product, it's minor features, and I'll talk to you about that as well. So let's start with AFib, near and dear to me. Undiagnosed AFib is a big problem. We've done some modeling work here. There's probably almost 600,000 patients with undiagnosed AFib. If you're conservative in the models, if you loosen this, it's 1.5 million in the US. It's expensive. Looking at 2014 dollars, the cost is 3.1 billion, and it wasn't just for cardiovascular hospitalization. There was a lot of incremental costs with non-cardiovascular hospitalization. So one might think that finding atrial fibrillation is a good thing. The problem is that with screening studies, what you have is controversy. So the 4 large screening studies are shown here: LOOP, REHEARSE, SCREEN AFib, and Stroke Stop. And if you meta-analyze them, you barely are at significance. You're still touching, the diamond is still touching the line of unity. And what we see is in the US, the 2022 update of US PSTF showed inconclusive. We don't have the data we need for this. So more trials are needed. It's not likely that this is going to benefit stroke alone. It probably could be an issue of prevention or delaying progression of heart failure, which affects 20 to 30% of patients with AFib. The trials thus far have been around stroke, and so there is opportunity to do more, but things remain inconclusive. And so this is a study that I was working on for a long time while still at the VA with Bill Bowden, managed to get it through early evaluation, and then luckily my mentor, Paul Heidenreich with Bill Bowden, led this to get fully funded. And this will be a trial of 14-day monitoring in 23,000 patients for a really broad outcome of cardiovascular, of death, stroke, systemic embolism, heart failure, hospitalization, and MI. Trials are great. We all believe in trials, but they take a long time. This won't get done. We won't have results until 2033. It's still 2024. So where do you go in the interim? Are you doing things? What's happening out in the world that I'm seeing now is a lot of ingenuity and innovation in value-based care systems, managed care. So if you're a Kaiser patient, you will be mailed a Cologuard test. This is being used in value-based care. There are other diagnostics that are home-based. The question is, should you do ambulatory monitoring in high-risk populations? And will you, in a value-based environment, be able to get to the answer quickly? A value-based care system doesn't really care if an RCT should be, their findings are generalizable to the world. They are actually more worried that the RCT doesn't generalize to their own population. So in this situation, what you get is the ability to test this out directly. And so we also know that this is going to be big as we go forward because Medicare Advantage and Medicare enrollment are shown here. Currently, 51% of all Medicare beneficiaries are in MA plans. The Congressional Budget Office predicts that by 2033, it's 62%. Others at CMS have been more rosy. If you look at where things are now, or at least last year in terms of mix, you can see that the Western states and California have 50 to 60% of their MA already enrolled. And so they're probably pulling it high. It's lower in some of the pockets you see here. In some states, it's greater than 60%. So when you have value-based systems, they are highly incentivized on two areas. One is risk adjustment and making sure that the population demographics are correctly identified and that patients' diseases are identified. And two, showing value and improvement in outcomes. So in this situation, actually, what we're seeing is large MA plans, including this one in the Southeast, are taking the chance and doing the implementation science themselves. This is a study of age 65 to 74 of patients who have MA patients. They all have heart failure. They're giving monitoring. Here are the early findings. What you see is AFib in 2%, SVT that's sustained in 4%. That may or may not be as actionable as we want. And so you are finding AFib. That's good, maybe. We don't know if it improves outcomes. The other challenge or problem is they're finding a lot of non-sustained VT. And so where are the tools to risk stratify for beats when you're just casually looking? How can you risk stratify and avoid a cascade of excess utilization? Those are the challenges, and that's where the work has to be done. So it's not really about the diagnostic, of course, it's about what to do with the data. Nonetheless, these kind of implementation studies will help refine that. As we get into VT, it is a problem. This is something Krishna, who was a former fellow here, I and Greg Marcus at UCSF wrote. There really is an epidemic of non-sustained VT. It's everywhere. It's in hospital monitoring, and if someone has a few beats, that just gets thrown out. They get discharged. No one ever knows that they had that arrhythmia unless they really carefully look for it, and even then they might not find it. But it's probably informative. The question is, what should we do with it? How can we risk stratify, and what do we do? So as value-based care take risk and start exploring new ways of doing things, it further puts pressure on the products and on the AI to improve their risk stratification. And that is sort of the cycle of translation and innovation I'm referring to here in the talk title. How about using product launches for implementation data? So this is some of the data that we have at iRhythm, and it's pretty amazing where you can have PROs, digital product, patient app data, the quality safety data, the sensor data, link it to EHR claims data, pull out unstructured data in alliances where you have healthcare systems, and link it to death. What that allows you to do is to implement, then measure. The old way, or the one way of doing it, is you create a digital tool and you implement it in the wild in a multi-center trial or in a single center trial, and you see if it works. And if it works, you scale. Well, here you sort of have the ecosystem in place. You have regulated products. and you can put things out that are adjacent to that. So one example would be what to do with a product launch. You can get patient satisfaction in months. You get the wear time, the signal quality. We know even minor changes in humidity and weather that's seasonal, what happens to the wear time and the adhesive quality. You can see incremental diagnostic yield. But then the adjacent technologies really, really matter, and you can see what those impacts are really at point of implementation. And so now it's a sort of a paradigm of implement cautiously and slowly, then measure, then scale. And so on the right, one of the big challenges we've had is in rural health, in patients who may have mistrust, and a box for a diagnostic, whatever that may be, shows up, there may be mistrust, whether it's Cologuard or the next thing. How do you get a patient to engage in that, explain why it was sent to them, because it may not be communicated, make sure they understand how to use it, and make sure they send it back. And so here on the right, you can see that we have various mechanisms to text and use apps to do this, and you can see what the return rates are. So you can do this one way and create a trial of a patient app or patient messaging, but sometimes it's even easier if you have the platform and the healthcare ecosystem in play just to add these in. This is not so much a randomized trial as it is an implementation trial of a product that was well vetted through user testing, user experience, human factors, and all of those factors before putting it out. But then when you put it out, you get your post-market performance. And so I think that sort of intersection of digital products with medical diagnostics and drugs in the value-based ecosystem as well is really creating a whole new paradigm of how research can be done very quickly to get the findings you need that are in a pragmatic way at the point of implementation and getting the result, frankly, immediately. So I'm going to close here and leave plenty of time for questions. For health tech, I've learned, and we've all learned at Stanford, that crossing the chasm is really hard. Death by pilot is the norm, and good results alone, as you've seen, can't save good products. All of us have experienced this. Many of us work on our own things. And so breaking that cycle of non-adoption really requires academia, industry, and healthcare system partners. The convergence of wearables, outpatient monitoring, and new technologies has been one example for me of how you might couple translation, adoption, and evidence generation. I really do think value-based care experiments are the future in how we think of implementation science and how we determine effectiveness in the real world, often to the point where it may even disintermediate the need for a more traditional multi-center trial for certain technologies. You obviously can't do that for an investigational drug or an investigational device, but rather than taking health technology and putting that in a framework of investigational drugs and devices in multi-center explanatory trials, this is now creating an ecosystem to really test and be rigorous scientifically in sort of new ways. And I think health tech companies, all of them, really have an opportunity to perform rigorous implementation science at scale and then share these learnings. I want to thank a lot of people who have helped me kind of in my journey, have been involved in this work, and they're too numerous to count. They're all shown here. But I really could not have done much of this or really anything leading up to this kind of in my sort of full phase of my full-time Stanford career. So I'm really grateful for to all the people and groups shown here. And with that, thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turakhia. That's wonderful. I love this talk because for so many reasons, having you come back, speak with us, but it's so much about the future of medicine and gives us a really vision to that. I want to welcome any questions from the audience. And I see some coming in. I see a bunch from Dr. Golden as well. Thanks for those questions, Dr. Golden. Can I just start off by just asking you, you're one of the best people to ask this question. We're thinking so much about the future of medicine, particularly with AI being AI has been something you've been working on well before it became such a mainstream thing in medicine. Can you give a sense of where you think the near future is, both in AFib detection? Are we going to have, is it going to be more through companies like Apple? And I know you work with Verily to create devices, Verily Google, or do you see that more companies will create more devices themselves, really be coming through these big tech companies that are going to be more involved with healthcare than we even realize now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's all the above. I don't think there's a single way or a preferred way. Um, right now, we wear watches and patches, but what's to stop us from having a telehealth call and a video recording of what's been shown of facial plethysmography, where you actually can see blood. You can digitally subtract on a still video and see blood pulsing across the face. Anytime you can get heart rate, you can usually get rhythm, right? So what's to stop ambient sensors in your house that you're buying for other reasons? What's to stop, an Alexa from having that? There's going to be tons of consumer convergence into medical. There will be better medical devices that are less burdensome. Um, we may get away from sort of insertable cardiac monitors, I believe, as these technologies improve. So I think it's all, quote, literally meeting in the middle. And then the problem is it's all thrown at us as clinicians. So probably it becomes sensor agnostic. And what becomes more important is making sure that the data is acted upon, right? So that's why we were so interested in trying to understand what happens with a notification. I mean, for example, after a consumer notification, would it make sense for a consumer company to take the next steps and really position that care for care navigation, right? Because the biggest challenge in healthcare is not the tech, it's care navigation. We all know how hard it is for our patients to come seen. We get emails, friends of friends. We have to do that for our own families. And so where the tech has lagged is sort of automating care navigation. So I think that becomes a step no matter how the signal comes through or the diagnosis is made.
Another question here. Can you talk more about the implementation and pragmatic research or value-based care experiments? How do we do that kind of work outside of value-based care in a place like Stanford? How do we incentivize these groups to not only focus on intermediate endpoints like AFib diagnosis, but also end outcomes?
Yeah, it's a really good question that Sneha had, and I mean she's done a lot of work here in the health system. Stanford is a great place to do this. We do have a large set of payers that come in and a high amount of heterogeneity in payment models. We're not a fully internally integrated healthcare system in the way you might think of Kaiser, Geisinger, or the VA, where these become a little easier, but even they have challenges of scaling. And so there are a few ways to do this. What many Stanford startups have done, and many people who've created things here, is that they've taken the technologies and refined them in value-based systems where there's an immediate incentive to kind of help iterate as they go to see what the value is. And then that data may help it generalize back to fee for service. And so the answer may be to use some of those local MA partners, MA plans. Signify Healthcare, Devoted Health, they're very tech forward, large, at scale, sort of primary care MA plans that do this work, right? And so they become partners where you could do a little bit of it at Stanford and then work with those systems too.
Great. A question here from Dr. Kim. Is there a uniform way devices will be required to relay information to most EHRs if groups, healthcare systems choose to accept that data? Kind of like a USB-C port for all devices. Any insight in those types of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's really frustrating, right? Because you can get the data on your phone and then it sort of stays on your phone. Um, there are some standards that Epic and the large vendors have for EHR integration that rely on very common standards that are in play. Some systems turn it on, some have not. Some systems rightfully don't want to because of the liability of having all this data pushed back to them that now they're responsible for. So there are other things that are happening. There is a new movement with Epic called Epic Aura, where they've inverted the business model so that the device manufacturer helps facilitate or really helps support finance pay for the installation. And so again, everyone has the things they want in Epic. Our IT group at Stanford has to prioritize. This may help push things through because it doesn't require resources. But again, it's system by system that things have to get turned on. And that also creates problems for patients in care navigation and portability because one system may have it, one system may not. When you don't, that's not a criteria by which you have access to determine how well they are integrated to your wearables as you pick a doctor or you pick a health plan. So I think there's a lot of work to do.
A question here, how do you see hospitals scaling to meet the need for monitoring events, and how will it be integrated to EMHR? So I guess arrhythmia or maybe any other types of events we may be able to monitor in-house.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think everyone should be monitored. That definitely isn't the point. The question is, how do you scale this? What the VA has done and what we wrote in the New England Journal paper for remote patient monitoring is that hasn't generally worked practice by practice, right? So most of the uptake came in a small subset of practices. If you look at that of a health affairs paper from a few years ago that looked at claims, where remote monitoring is probably useful is not in perpetuity. At least from the way it's being managed in the reimbursable, transmit your vitals 16 out of 30 days and we can, bill Medicare for it. That becomes more valuable at transitions of care. So discharge, right? Heart failure, GDMT escalation after discharge, pneumonia, etc. That won't scale practice by practice unless systems develop hubs. So Methodist, a few other large systems around the country have developed RPM hubs to do this. They've even gone one step. UMass has a very large hospital at home program, which is a high priority in Massachusetts, where they have figured out the care stack they're a very unique system. So UMass is not super urban. So imagine trying to run hospital at home if you're a hospital in New York City and having, finding people in all their buildings. That's hard. They're suburban. If they're really rural, it becomes hard. They own their own EMS and they have their own nursing force more broadly. So now that UMass owns their own EMS system and has nurses, they can deploy those out for H2H. So patients get seen in the ER, they're considered to be eligible for hospital home. They go straight from the ER to home. A nurse sees them once or twice a day, whatever the requirement is. EMS does transitions of care, and they partner with diagnostic companies if and when needed for monitoring, right? That's really hard to do at a place like Stanford for many reasons, but that's what's happening. And so as those kind of hurdles get better, we'll start seeing more of that. But it really will come down to centralized hubs.
And Dr. Turakhia, I have a number of questions from Dr. Donald Golden. And they're about left ventricular assist device. Not sure how much you'll be able to answer, but he just asked a number of questions. How many years will it last? It's 15 years now. Will AI become the brain of it? So how will AI impact it? Monitoring muscle twitch. Is there any input you have on the use of the AI technology in LVAD?
I mean, I was talking only about diagnostics, so I can't really comment on LVADs and therapy. There's a lot of LVADs, a lot of LVAD companies, a lot of exciting work done, and I think our heart failure colleagues would be able to best answer that. So nothing that I'm working on or I'm aware of that would overlap with the things I've shared.
Well, I'll say, Dr. Golden, I'll reach out to you and perhaps we'll get someone to come talk about that in a future talk as well. But thanks for those questions, Dr. Golden. We have Dr. Valentine. She says, fantastic talk. Thank you. Given the growing importance of genomic diagnostics, how do you see that kind of data being integrated into monitoring systems you described?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think as Dr. Valentine said, the technology exists, or she referred to. We don't see Medicare Advantage plans doing full on, limited or full sequencing, right? Like you don't get genetic testing. You can go get it retail in your 23andMe, or you can get it at specialized places like Stanford, or you can get them disease-focused genetic testing. But I'm not aware of any MA plan that when you walk through the door and you get genetic testing. And so then the question is, do you partner with diagnostics and is there value there? There probably is incremental value for sure. Where we're going to learn that are going to be the large cohorts that start looking at outcomes, right? So UK Biobank is probably the best one because they have MRI, echo, 12-lead ambulatory monitoring, genetic testing. Patrick Eleanor and his group at Broad and MGH have been doing a lot of work where there's some generative AI examples where people are trying to reconstruct ECGs from limited samples of genetics. Again, it's very, very early. So I think there is a lot to do, but I think it's sort of, what is that full diagnostic kit going to be when you walk into a value-based care plan? I think that's really the question that we don't know yet, but I could see genetics as part of that as if and when we get some more maturity and better data.
Dr. Leibowitz has this question. I was hoping that you would touch on it. I know that A lot of this technology can be a double-edged sword, at least as it grows, as quality. But so he asked, does anybody know the effect on a doctor's practice and potential burnout of patients forwarding self-obtained diagnostic studies? So everybody with that alerts on the Apple Watches, is the doctor irresponsible follow-up? Where do they get the time to do this? So the impact on that comment.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, some of that happened here, right? When Steve Quake walked into Ewan's office and gave him a USB drive for a fully sequenced genome. So I think it's a great area for study. I don't know if it's been studied in terms of burnout. I think there still are a lot of gaps in patients even consumers getting access to care. So if you take a consumer wearable, generally people are not buying it for a specific ECG or arrhythmia feature. You buy a watch for a lot of things, and this just so happens to be on it. And you decide, hey, this sounds like a good thing, I'll opt in. And then you start getting a whole bunch of notifications about your AFib, and followed by an Instagram notification, and then this and that. And then does it get lost? Does it surface up? Do people do anything with it? I think that goes back to we have this gap of taking what we find and making sure that there is a closed loop for it. That closed loop really can't be a doctor. I mean, that's where it gets challenging. It can't be that person's PCP all the time. That is not sustainable. Technology scales much more easily. So then the question is, how do you do it? Is there a role for generative AI? There's companies working on care navigation and chatbots. Is it acute care telehealth? Should those healthcare offerings kind of be on the continuum and be available directly through that app? In the Apple Heart Study, if you got a regular notification, all you had to do was press a button from within the app, and you had a FaceTime call to the telehealth provider that we used for that virtual visit. That's great in a trial. How do you scale that?
Another question here. Thank you for sharing your Vanguard work. Subtle but consequential cardiovascular findings emerge with lab or hospital-based stress exercise testing with ECG, otherwise missed at rest. How would outpatients at risk, especially if exercise shy, push themselves into stress testing mode in the absence of expert assistance?
Yeah, so I think the question is around what to do. I mean, we still use fairly traditional metrics on assessment of workload, ischemia, hemodynamic response, and stress testing for risk stratification. That's sort of the basis of even when stress testing was done more routinely preoperatively. It was really more about the workload than anything else that determined what procedure you could have. I think it'd be an interesting area for AI to be used in stress testing. I actually never thought of that this whole time. I'm sure somebody's doing that. I'm now interested and probably will look that up right after this talk.
Dr. Turakhia, it's been wonderful. I have a number of questions, by the way, I wanted to get to, but we're hitting 9. We're going to go way over if I try. It's such a just great to have you back with us today, and thank you for doing that. We're at Vanguard work. I think it's amazing work that you're doing, and it's the cutting edge of everything in the future. I hope to invite you back here again, or can't wait to have you back with us more formally in the future. But thank you for joining with us today and sharing all this great stuff for the future of medicine.
Errol, it's a privilege as always to be here. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone attending for listening and for those great questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody for sticking with us. Have a great rest of the day. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.